So I got asked a few questions about this. Some folks noticed it. This is the Wagner dual flow adjustable PCV valve. I saw this online. It's a relatively new product as I understand it. I have had an issue with the rear main seal leaking on this engine for some time. I've replaced it 2 or 3 times now. It just always leaks anytime it's running. This is supposed to help with that. I've heard guys mention that this unit will help with that. So I wanted to give it a shot. So this is the unit, a close-up of it. It has idle and cruise circuits. They're both adjustable. This is where the vacuum would connect, obviously, just like a regular PCV valve. This right here is a vacuum port. This is how you set it. There is a nipple that you would replace this plug with. It's this little brass nipple they include. You take the plug out, you put this in finger tight to hook up your vacuum gauge. These 2 bolts on top right here would separate the upper and the lower portion of the housing. That is because it has 2 different springs that you can put in it. So the heavier wire spring is for higher vacuum. It's above 10 inches of vacuum. The longer but thinner wire unit or spring is for 7 to 10 inches of vacuum. Those are both at idle, your idle vacuum. So those are the 2 springs that you can put in it, which you would do by separating the unit with those 2 bolts. The third mode that you can run this in, which I am going to run it in now, or I'm going to try to run it in now, that I've already set it up for, is no spring. So they tell you if you have 7 inches of vacuum at idle or less, or if your vacuum signal is choppy with larger cams, which this has a relatively large cam in it, and it's got decent amount of overlap, so the vacuum signal is very choppy at idle. It's got a lot of overlap. They tell you not to run a spring in it, and to run it without one, and to run the cruise circuit set screw flush with the top of the unit. So I currently have no spring in this, but between 7 and 10 inches in a steady vacuum signal, you're going to want to run the light spring. Above 10 inches of vacuum at idle, you're going to want to run the heavy spring. So that's the cruise circuit. The idle set screw right here. This is your idle vacuum circuit. They give you a chart for this, how to set it. It's in the instructions. If you're over 400 cubic inches like I am, this is a 468. They tell you to run this at 2 turns out from all the way closed. So they tell you to close the idle screw all the way down to where it just lightly where it lightly touches, bottoms out. You back it out 2 turns for 400 and above cubic inches. They tell you 2 to 3 inches. 3 inches is the maximum you can have it open. Less than 400, follow the chart. It'll tell you how many turns to have it backed out from the bottom. So I mentioned that I have set this up for the fixed orifice mode, or no spring. So they, as I was talked about before, where they recommend with the vacuum settings, I was right on the edge, so I tried it with the light spring originally. It appears that at idle I am not seeing an oil leak like I was. It definitely would leak whether it was idling or driving. I would have a rear main leak. It looks to me, I let it idle for about 15-20 minutes and I didn't see a drip, which is unusual for this motor. So I believe that it is functioning, that the idle circuit is working, but I drove it just a couple miles around the block and came back and I had a few drips of oil. So I think that the cruise circuit has something to do with that. They, like I said, they instruct you if you're less than 7 inches of vacuum, or if you have a choppy vacuum signal to not run a spring in it. So I'm going to switch it and not run a spring. There's no spring in here. I've set the cruise screw flush with the top. They say it's not too critical, but in general, this should be flush with the top if you're not running a spring. So I haven't used it like that yet, but I'm going to drive it now that I've changed that out and set it. Now, let me talk about adjusting this if you are running one of the two springs. The adjustment procedure is the same for both springs. It's not any different. So the way that you would do this, and I can actually demonstrate this right here. They give you the Allen keys for it and everything. So once you've set your idle screw, you're going to want to set the cruise screw. They tell you 10 turns, but it's also the easier way to do it. They just said, half an inch. So you're going to set this cruise screw 1/2 an inch above the surface here, which is about 10 turns. So you'll see it's pretty far out. So that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. So that's about a 1/2 an inch out. So if it had a spring in it, that's where I would start with this. I talked about the vacuum port earlier, so you need a vacuum gauge. It does not include one. Most folks have one. If not, you can get one. They're not very expensive. Take the plug out, put the nipple in here, hand tight, and hook up your vacuum gauge here. You're going to insert it in the baffle. There's enough for it to bite onto here to get into the baffle where it won't come out, I found. So it's not going to go all the way in, obviously, because you have the vacuum nipple hooked up here like this. And then you're going to hook up your vacuum line, obviously, to your PCV vacuum line. And you're going to start it. You want to run it. You got to get it warm. It's got to be at full operating temperature. Have your vacuum gauge hooked up here. And then what they tell you to do with this set, just as I described, you're going to rotate the screw in until you see the vacuum gauge come up from 0. The way I saw it, it wasn't exactly as they described it, and I don't know if that's because I don't have a whole lot of vacuum at idle, but when I turned this in, I turned the cruise screw in, I could hear it pop. I could hear the valve pop open, and I immediately had, I think, 3 to 4 inches of vacuum. So then what they instruct you to do is to back it back out until the valve closes and it goes back down to less than 1 inch of vacuum. For me, it went to 0. And then you're supposed to go another 3/4 of a turn further counterclockwise. So again, 1/2 inch above, you're going to have it up at operating temperature. You're going to screw it in until the vacuum gauge comes up to about, 3 to 5 inches of vacuum. You'll hear it open, and then you're going to back it out until it goes back to 0 or less than 1 inch of vacuum, and then another 3/4 of a turn. So this is just to give you an idea what it looks like. I'm holding it at an angle so you can see it. This would actually sit in here better if I turn the valve, but I want you to be able to see it. This is how you set it up with the vacuum gauge. It's a little bit hard to do it, but I found I was able to get it to kind of hold itself here to do it. So you vacuum gauge, and there's your set screws. Obviously, you don't leave it like this. Once you get it all set up and you backed it off that final amount that I described on the cruise screw, then you can just simply take this apart. You would take the nipple back out of here and put the set screw back in, and you're set to go. So, like I said, I'll do a follow-up on how this works out for me. Let me show you the way that I'm going to have this again. I'm not running a spring. I just described how you do this if you do run a spring. I am not, so I'm putting the set screw for the cruise circuit flush with the top here. I have my idle screw at 2 turns. The instructions are pretty good about telling you about how to set the idle screw. I'm getting the feeling that I'm at 2 turns. This is probably going to end up closer to 3 turns, I think. You don't want to go too far because then you start drawing oil from the underneath the baffle and the valve cover. You don't want to. I'm not running a catch can on this, so you don't want to start drawing oil out of here. Also, if you start drawing too much vacuum through here, I'm running fuel injection on this, and I don't want to override my idle air control on it. I'm not too sure how this would work with a carburetor. I have a feeling if you open it up too far, it's going to be like you got a pretty substantial vacuum leak. So you don't want to have that problem. Obviously, that's why I think they limit this to 3 turns at the most backed out for the idle. With fuel injection, it's not going to care. It's just the IAC might close all the way, and it's going to be drawing all of its idle air from the crankcase, which, you don't want to do that because then it's not adjusting correctly, and you probably start drawing oil out of here, and you don't want to do that because then you start using up oil. So, but you do want to evacuate well enough, to stop any oil leaks. So that's the purpose of this adjustable valve, is to be able to regulate based on how your engine is built versus a standard one that's just got some preset spring in it. This is tailored. You can tailor it to your needs. That's how it's supposed to work. So I haven't got a final opinion on this yet. I think it is helping, but it hasn't stopped my oil leak. Some guys say that it was a miracle for them. It stopped them from having drips. I'm not sure if I have some other issue. I've changed my rear main a few times and it still leaks, and that could be for a number of reasons, but I followed all the instructions and offset the seal and it still has an issue. So I'm thinking it's crankcase pressure. One of the other things I want to mention too with this valve, they tell you to have you got to have a breather on the other side, obviously, and they say make sure that it's you change it every so often, make sure it's not soaked in oil, the breather on the other side. So that's the basics of this. That's how you set it up. So anyways, I'll let you know how this works out, but that's the unit.